It was just after the Easter service at St. Edward's in the quiet village of Nether Farthing, when the vicarage maid, Elsie Dodd, let out a shriek that startled even the most sedate of the congregation still milling outside. Reverend Edmund. Chiswell, a man of sparse words and unshakable routine, had not appeared for the traditional tea and biscuits following the service, a minor oddity in itself. But when Elsie entered the vicar's study to fetch his reading glasses, she found him slumped in his chair, eyes open but glassy, lips slightly parted as if caught in a final prayer. His tea, half drunk, sat cooling beside him on a copy of the Times. A faint sweet scent lingered in the air, orange blossom perhaps, or something more synthetic. Within the hour, a local doctor declared him dead, likely from heart failure, but it was Constable Rowntree, always erring on the side of prudence, who noted the faint rim of white powder on the rim of the teacup and recommended a quiet word with the county coroner. Within days, it was confirmed. The Reverend had been poisoned, yet no one could imagine why. Reverend Chiswell was universally liked, perhaps not loved, but respected, known for his punctuality, unwavering sermons, and a peculiar fondness for gardening. He lived modestly, kept no known enemies, and hadn't left Nether Farthing in over 20 years. The vicarage was undisturbed. No sign of a break-in, no items stolen. His wallet, personal papers, and locked drawer containing petty cash were all intact. And, as several elderly parishioners hastened to point out, he was in the midst of drafting a new hymn index for the church, hardly the sort of task to draw out the murderous instincts of even the most impatient choir member. The clue that puzzled everyone most was the hymn book. It had been placed, not tossed, neatly atop the Reverend's desk, shut as though returned after regular use. But this was no ordinary hymnal. It was an old, leather-bound edition, with dog-eared pages and notes scribbled in pencil along the margins, clearly Chiswell's personal copy. When Constable Rowntree leafed through it absent-mindedly, a small piece of paper fluttered out, landing beside the inkwell. At first, it looked like a scrap torn from an old envelope, but when held to the light, a few words became legible. "I never meant to," followed by a series of illegible smudges, and then the phrase, "behind the garden wall, forgive me." There was no name, no date. The handwriting didn't match the Reverend's, slanted, jagged, a different hand entirely. It was puzzling and oddly theatrical, as if someone had tried to leave a riddle rather than a message. The vicarage was locked that morning, as it usually was, except for the front door which Elsie used when arriving at 6 to start the fire. She claimed the Reverend had already been awake. She'd heard his kettle boiling and spotted him through the kitchen window, standing in his dressing gown and stirring honey into his cup. According to Elsie, he'd seemed perfectly well, merely quiet. By 8:30, he was dressed in full robes and ready to leave for church. He was last seen by Mrs. Penelope Drew, the choir mistress, at approximately 10 minutes before service. "He looked distracted," she said, clutching his hymn book as though it was something precious. "Odd. He usually leaves it in the pew." No one else recalled anything strange. He delivered his sermon, accepted handshakes at the door, and wandered back to the vicarage alone, while the rest of the village enjoyed refreshments. Miss Marple, seated in the back pew for Easter as she always was, had noted the unusual hush in Chiswell's sermon that morning, not so much sombre as tentative, pausing often, eyes flickering toward the lectern, where the hymn book rested unusually close. She had thought at the time that he might be unwell or wrestling with some difficult passage of scripture. When the news came later that day of his death, she did not gasp like the others. Instead, she frowned faintly and returned to the church, while the rest murmured around the tea table. She had her own habits when something didn't sit right, and one of them was retracing patterns while they were still fresh. The lectern still held the hymn number cards, 142, 93, 28. Curious choices. Hymn 142 was "Come, Ye Disconsolate." Hymn 93, "Beneath the Cross of Jesus." Hymn 28, Abide with me. All melancholy, rarely chosen in combination, more fit for a funeral than Easter morning. Miss Marple's visit to the vicarage that evening was under the pretext of offering Elsie some comfort. She brought over a small jar of blackcurrant jam and took stock of the study while Elsie fetched a tray. The desk was spotless, save the closed hymn book, which now sat beside a pale orchid in a cracked vase. He always read from that old copy, Elsie offered as she poured the tea. Wouldn't use the new ones even after the council bought them last year. Miss Marple flipped through it casually. Her fingers stopped at a familiar tune, Rock of Ages, where she saw something peculiar. A line underlined twice in pencil. Be of sin, the double cure. She looked at Elsie. Did the Reverend keep correspondence in here? Elsie blinked. Not that I know of, miss, though he often slipped notes into it. Reminders for the Sunday announcements. The local police, meanwhile, were at a loss. The poison had been traced to a rare compound not easily obtained. An imported pesticide no longer available in Britain, suggesting careful planning. Yet there were no fingerprints on the teacup, no signs of tampering in the kitchen. The only people with access that morning were Elsie, Reverend Chiswell himself, and anyone he might have admitted personally after service. But why would someone leave a note like that and not destroy it? And if it was a confession, what did behind the garden wall mean? A hiding place? A grave? By the time Miss Marple asked permission to inspect the vicarage garden herself, most had written the case off as an unsolvable tragedy, a mad parishioner, perhaps, or an old, untraceable grudge. But she had a theory, thin as it was, and as with all her theories, it was born not from dramatic intuition, but from years of quiet observation, of how people spoke, how they hesitated, and especially how they lied without knowing it. And she remembered something Mrs. Drew had said that struck her oddly now, that Chiswell had clutched the hymn book like it was precious, not important, not necessary, precious, as though he feared losing it, as though someone might take it. And that made Miss Marple quite certain that the Reverend had known something that morning, perhaps even feared something. The real mystery, she thought as she adjusted her gloves and stepped into the vicarage garden, wasn't just who had poisoned him. It was what he had been trying to protect, and why, of all places, the only trace of the truth had been hidden in a hymn book. Miss Marple returned to the vicarage garden early the next morning with her gardening gloves tucked neatly into her handbag and a modest request to Elsie, could she gather a few clippings of the Reverend's prized hellebores for the church flower rota. Elsie, grateful for any kindness and clearly shaken, consented with a nod, motioning toward the flower bed that edged the old stone wall behind the study window. Miss Marple wandered there slowly, glancing at the low wall dividing the vicarage from the back lane, moss creeping along its cracks. The ivy, heavy and untamed, draped down like a curtain hiding a neglected patch. She paused, knelt, and gently pressed her fingers into the soil at the base of the wall where the plants thinned. The earth had been turned recently, not deeply, but enough to suggest someone had disturbed it. She saw the faint outline of a spade's edge, a shallow dig, fresh fill. She didn't disturb it yet, not without certainty. Instead, she walked back toward the kitchen, eyes grazing the uneven cobblestones beneath the side door. A faint trail of petals, pale lavender-hued, led from the patch of turned earth toward the bin. Odd. Hellebores didn't shed like that, and no other flowers in that area matched the petals. She tucked the thought away, much like one places a bookmark in a story before it turns. Inside, the local inspector, Mr. Pritchard, had returned for a second pass. Gruff and decent, he was convinced the crime had been committed by someone within the village, possibly someone deranged, but no motive had yet emerged. He was holding court in the drawing room with the late Reverend's sister, Miss Harriet Chiswell, who had arrived the night before from Bath. She was a tall, pinched woman in a dove-grey coat, her voice clipped, her movements rigid, as if any sudden gesture might disrupt the tight web of composure she had built around herself. "I don't see how you expect to find anything new, Inspector," she said. "My brother was a man of peace. He had no secrets, none that I ever knew, and I knew him well." Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly with her knitting in her lap, looked up. "That's very fortunate, Miss Chiswell. So many of us go through life never knowing someone fully until it's too late." She smiled gently. "You must have been quite close." "We wrote every Sunday," Harriet replied. "And I visited. At Christmas without fail. He was content here. He had his parish, his books, his little garden." She paused. "Though, come to think of it, he did mention someone bothering him in recent letters. A man, he said, asking strange questions. He thought it might be about a land matter, something to do with the parish boundary. But Edmund wasn't one for details. Said it would sort itself out. Did he mention a name? No, and I didn't press him. It seemed beneath his notice." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Did your brother ever have occasion to hide things? Letters, perhaps? In the hymn book, for instance?" The question seemed to strike Harriet as ridiculous, and for a moment she blinked rapidly. Edmund. Good heavens, no, he was too literal for such games. He hated melodrama. Miss Marple only nodded. And yet someone felt a need to leave a half-written confession in his hymn book. Strange behaviour, wouldn't you say? Before Harriet could answer, the constable returned from the back of the house. "Inspector," he said, holding out a sealed envelope, "I found this behind the wardrobe in the Reverend's bedroom, slipped right between the wall and the floorboards. Looks like it fell." The envelope was old, yellowing and unmarked except for a short sentence scribbled on the back. "For EC, should I not return." Inside was a single sheet, a typed letter, unsigned. Inspector Pritchard read it aloud. "I've made peace with my choice, though it may cost me more than I imagined. If you find this, it means I failed to keep my end. The garden wall will bear the rest." "That makes 2 cryptic notes about the garden wall," he muttered, rubbing his jaw, "and still no name, no idea what the wall conceals, or why it mattered so much." "Perhaps the wall isn't what matters," Miss Marple said softly. "But what was once hidden there and removed?" "Removed?" Pritchard asked. "Possibly. Or perhaps it's still there and simply overlooked. It's an old trick. Use something familiar to hide the unfamiliar." Miss Marple waited until the inspector turned his attention back to questioning Harriet, before rising and quietly slipping into the study once more. The hymn book was still on the desk, and she opened it again, flipping carefully through its pages. She paused at one that had been slightly more worn than the rest. Hymn 174, "The Day Thou Gavest." A small corner of paper peeked out, folded tightly, nearly invisible. She coaxed it free. It was a church ledger slip, the kind used to mark donations or weekly expenses. But it wasn't filled in. Instead, someone had penciled 3 initials. At the bottom, in a hasty scrawl, JBT. Miss Marple considered this. Not a name familiar to her in the village, but it seemed unlikely to be random. She took the slip with her as she stepped back into the hallway where Elsie passed with an armful of clean linens. "Elsie, forgive me," Miss Marple said, "but have you ever heard of someone with those initials? JBT? Perhaps a visitor to the Reverend recently?" Elsie frowned and shifted the pile in her arms. "No one by that name here. Oh, but there was a man who came by 3 Sundays ago, bit sharp-eyed. Asked to speak with the Reverend privately. Said he was doing research on local church records. Gave me a funny look when I asked his name. Just said Benton, and walked in like he owned the place." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That would be Mr. Benton of JBT, then. I wonder if our mysterious questioner didn't leave more of a mark than anyone noticed." Later that afternoon, with the authorities no closer to a suspect and the inquest delayed pending further evidence, Miss Marple took her umbrella and returned to the garden alone. She brought no spade, only a knitting needle. She bent near the wall, choosing a spot that her earlier touch had marked as disturbed, and poked gently into the soil. On the third try, she struck something that gave a faint metallic clink. After, brushing away the dirt, she uncovered a small tin box, no bigger than a biscuit tin, rusted at the hinges but intact. It had no lock. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth and stained with time, were 3 items: a photograph of a woman with a soft smile and dark eyes, a wedding ring wrapped in a ribbon, and a certificate of marriage, Reverend Edmund Chiswell to one, Margaret Benton, dated July 1918. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. So, the Reverend had secrets after all. And someone, perhaps Mr. Benton or a relative, had reason to dig them up. Miss Marple took the tin box straight to Inspector Pritchard, who met her at the vicarage gate with a mix of irritation and curiosity. When she explained where she had found it, his face tightened. He opened it with deliberate care, as if still half hoping it would contain nothing of consequence. But once he saw the faded certificate and the photograph, he sat down heavily on the vicarage's front bench. "Married?" he muttered. "He was married, Reverend Chiswell." "Evidently," Miss Marple replied, "and to a woman whose surname, coincidentally or not, matches the man who visited 3 Sundays ago. Margaret Benton. This Mr. Benton, then, may not have been here on parish business at all. Perhaps he was family." Pritchard looked back toward the house. "His sister made no mention of any wife. She said she visited at Christmas and wrote on Sundays. That leaves plenty of days unaccounted for." They returned inside, where Miss Harriet Chiswell was seated stiffly in the Reverend's favourite chair, knitting without enthusiasm. The inspector set the tin on the side table. "Miss Chiswell, do you recognize this?" She didn't rise, only tilted her head toward the contents. At the sight of the photograph, her fingers froze on the needles. Her lips parted, but no words. "Came." "I take it that's a yes," said Pritchard. Harriet stood abruptly and crossed to the fireplace, turning her back. "He was ashamed," she said after a moment. "Ashamed of what it had meant. It didn't last. She left. Or he sent her away. I don't know the truth of it." "When did this happen?" "Before he came to Nether Farthing. Before he was ordained. It was brief. She was older, from London. I think she had a child by another man before they met. Edmund said he forgave her, but something broke between them. He told me once, in one of his darker moods, that he had tried to forget her through God's work." Pritchard tapped the certificate. "Why keep this hidden all these years?" "Because he never divorced her," Harriet said quietly. "As far as the church was concerned, they were still married. He couldn't serve openly with that knowledge. He took his vows seriously. I suppose he hoped it would stay buried." Miss Marple, who had been watching Harriet closely, noted the tremor that accompanied her words. Not sorrow, fear. It wasn't only the scandal that disturbed her. It was something else. "Did your brother speak to you about someone named Benton recently?" she asked gently. Harriet turned. "No, but I did notice a letter he never opened. It had no return address. He'd tucked it behind the clock on the mantel. I saw it when I dusted." Pritchard gestured. "Fetch it, please." She returned moments later with a thin, crumpled envelope. The inspector slit it open and read aloud. "You know who I am. You knew this day would come. I want the truth, the full truth, and nothing less. If you don't come forward, I will." Miss Marple asked, "May I?" He passed it to her. She studied the paper, then the envelope. The ink was fresh, the pressure uneven. Someone had written in haste, or perhaps trembling with emotion. She folded it, pocketed it quietly. "I should like a word with Elsie." The maid was folding napkins in the kitchen. Miss Marple sat beside her and spoke in a quiet, matter-of-fact voice. "Elsie, I don't suppose you remember if the Reverend ever received visitors he didn't log in the guest book?" Elsie looked startled. "Well, there was the Benton fellow," I mentioned. "But now you say it. Last Thursday someone came by in the evening. I was already going off duty. Saw a man waiting near the gate. I told the Reverend and he just nodded, said, 'I'll deal with it.' I asked if he wanted me to bring tea. He said no, and when I looked out an hour later, the man was gone. Did you see what he looked like?" "Not properly. Tall. Wore a long coat. Didn't speak when I passed him." "Did the Reverend seem upset afterward?" "More distracted than usual. Sat up past midnight reading that old hymn book. I could hear the pages turning. Pritchard joined them a moment later, with a list of names from the church council. We've got some characters here. Mr. Lionel Croot, parish treasurer, lives 2 doors down. Mrs. Drew, the choir mistress. A Mr. Welch, who's head of the cemetery board. And of course young Tom Abbott, the groundskeeper. All had regular dealings with Chiswell." Miss Marple nodded. "Then perhaps it's time we heard what each of them has to say." They began with Lionel Croot, a rotund, red-faced man who wore his indignation like a scarf. "Reverend Chiswell was a good man," he insisted, seated stiffly at the vicarage table. "Bit naive when it came to money, but that's what I was. For had kept the books balanced, saw that no one fiddled the collection box. I dare say someone's trying to smear his name now that he's gone. Scandal sells, doesn't it?" "Do you recognize this woman?" Pritchard asked, showing the photo. Croot blinked at it. "No. Doesn't look local. I've been here 30 years, never seen her. Do you know a Mr. Benton? Name doesn't ring a bell. Could be one of those city types who come through and think they're doing charity, always poking about." Miss Marple asked gently, "Do you know of any disagreements between the Reverend and anyone in the council?" Croot hesitated. "Only the usual squabbles over flower budgets and altar cloths. Nothing murder-worthy." They moved on to Mrs. Drew, who received them in her sitting room lined with hymnals and choir schedules. "Poor Edmund," she said, sipping tea. "I did worry about him lately. He seemed haunted, somehow. Especially these past few weeks. He'd pause mid-sentence sometimes and lose his train of thought. Did he ever mention a visitor named Benton?" She pursed her lips. "Not to me, but someone came to choir practice one afternoon asking about old parish records. Said he was doing genealogical research. He seemed too polished, too intense. Asked a lot of questions about the Reverend's past. Didn't give a name. They visited Mr. Welch next, who was curt and brusque. Haven't had a proper word with Edmund in months. Only see him when a grave needs blessing." "Did you ever hear of Margaret Benton?" Miss Marple asked. "Never, though—" He scratched his chin. "You might try Tom Abbott. That lad's always poking about, asking odd questions. Found him near the vestry late at night once. Said he was just fetching tools. I didn't believe it. They found Tom Abbott behind the church, repainting the fence. He was in his early 20s, nervous, with restless hands. When shown the photograph, he looked too long. She looks familiar, he said finally, voice low. Saw her picture once in the vicar's desk. Thought she might have been his sister. Didn't say anything. You've been in the vestry after hours? Just once, Tom replied quickly. I thought maybe he'd left it unlocked. Wanted to borrow a tool. I didn't touch anything. Miss Marple said nothing, just watched his eyes. You weren't looking for tools, Tom. You were looking for something you thought he hid. He flushed. I only wanted to know what he wasn't telling me. I'm not a thief. But he was hiding something. I knew it. Why? Tom hesitated. Because he told me not to ask about my mother. The silence that followed was heavy. Pritchard frowned. Your mother? Tom nodded, staring at the earth. I never knew her. Grew up in the village home. But when I started working at the church, Reverend Chiswell looked at me like he recognized something. I asked him once and he said, "Let the past rest." But he started leaving me money. Quietly. Just enough. Miss Marple drew in a breath. "Did you ever ask him if he knew who your mother was?" I tried, but he looked so sad, like it would kill him to say it. Miss Marple stood slowly. The photograph, the ring, the ribbon, it all aligned now. But the motive remained murky. If Tom was connected to the Reverend by blood, someone else had known, and feared what that truth would bring to light. Someone who had reason to silence it forever. Miss Marple left the churchyard that afternoon with a deepening sense that the truth lay not in a single act, but in a pattern. Small gestures, discarded conversations, glances held too long or avoided altogether. The Reverend's death was no crime of impulse. It was premeditated, shaped by something old and carefully buried, and that something had now started to bleed through the quiet seams of nether farthing. The tangled web of motives began with Tom Abbott. If he was the child of Margaret Benton, conceived before or after her brief marriage to Reverend Chiswell, it would explain the Reverend's hidden guilt, the quiet payments, the mournful looks. But why poison now? Tom had no reason to harm the man who had, in his own quiet way, tried to offer support. If anything, Tom had seemed hungry for answers, not revenge. His frustration was that of a boy reaching towards something half-promised, not a killer masking his deeds. Then there was Miss Harriet Chiswell, who had withheld the truth of her brother's marriage until cornered, and who had gone pale at the sight of that photograph. She had motive in the form of fear of public disgrace, of the scandal that might unravel her brother's posthumous respectability and her own place in the village. But poison was a cruel tool, and her words, while clipped and defensive, didn't carry the coldness of someone capable of murder. Unless, of course, she had felt cornered and alone, convinced that silence was the only path to protect the name she'd spent decades upholding. Miss Marple sat by her front window that evening, the tin box placed beside a saucer of cooling tea. She wrote down the known facts in her notebook, noting not just what was said, but who had said it and how. Croot, the treasurer, had been too defensive, too eager to shut down the idea of scandal. What would the exposure of a secret marriage mean for church finances? If donations fell, if trust crumbled, if the bishop intervened, would that threaten his own modest comforts? Perhaps. But again, no evidence linked him to the act, only to the instinct for self-preservation. And Mrs. Drew, the choir mistress, she had offered a little too much. Not lies necessarily, but shaped truths. She'd conveniently remembered a visitor only after others mentioned him. She described the Reverend's mental decline in theatrical terms. Haunted, distracted, phrasing meant to colour the memory. Was she trying to guide suspicion or protect someone? Then there was the mysterious Mr. Benton. His identity had become central now. Was he Margaret Benton's son, a nephew, or something more complicated? If he'd come demanding answers from the Reverend, he may have discovered the hidden link between Chiswell and Tom. And if that revelation risked opening a wound deeper than anyone imagined, inheritance, bloodline, scandal, then someone else might have had a powerful reason to act before those secrets surfaced. The following morning, Miss Marple returned to the vicarage under the pretext of helping with the sorting of the Reverend's personal effects. Harriet, dry-eyed but subdued, welcomed her with a wan nod. In the study, Miss Marple began pulling books from the shelves, her fingers brushing across spines as if casually tidying, until she reached the back row, where a thin crack in the plaster caught her eye. A slip of folded paper had been pushed behind the books. She coaxed it free and read the words slowly. "He says he is my son, but he cannot be. Margaret never told me. If it's true, I am too late to repair it. If it's false, He means to destroy me. I no longer know which I fear more. The note was dated the day before Easter. Miss Marple took the note to Inspector Pritchard, who read it in silence, then cursed softly under his breath. So the Reverend was being blackmailed or manipulated. He was being confronted, Miss Marple said, by a truth he'd buried so deeply he no longer recognized it. This Benton may have been his son, or perhaps believed himself to be. Either way, the Reverend's past had returned, and it frightened him. But the poison, Pritchard said, it still doesn't fit. Who administered it, and why now? Perhaps we should speak to Mr. Croot again, Miss Marple said, but this time let's press him not on money, but on Margaret Benton. They found him in the church vestry, fidgeting with the collection tallies. When asked again, he started to deny knowledge, then stopped himself. I did know her, he admitted finally. Years ago, before she left the village. She was not the kind of woman you forget. And Edmund was smitten, but she disappeared. Rumours were thick. Some said she was pregnant, others that she ran off to London with someone else. All I know is Edmund stopped speaking to me after I asked too many questions. Did she have a child? Pritchard asked. Croot's jaw clenched. That I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me. Miss Marple stepped closer. What if she did, and that child returned, calling himself Benton? Would that upset the balance here? Financially, perhaps? Croot gave a hollow laugh. If the boy was Chiswell's heir, and someone proved it, yes, there would be legal claims. To the vicarage property, perhaps even the savings account. The church has rules, but money has longer arms than faith. And if that inheritance passed to Tom Abbott? I hadn't thought of that, Croot admitted. But yes, if Tom was the child, then it changes everything. He wouldn't even need proof of parentage. People believe what they want. Miss Marple left the vestry with one conclusion firm in her mind. Someone had discovered the possibility that Tom was Chiswell's son, likely through the mysterious Mr. Benton, who had perhaps come not only to confront Chiswell, but to warn him. And that knowledge threatened more than just pride or peace. It threatened property, legacy, and place. She returned to the vicarage garden and found Harriet once more, seated beside the rose bush in quiet reflection. Miss Marple sat down next to her, without speaking. After a pause, she said, "You've always managed things so carefully, Miss Chiswell. I imagine the thought of a boy, illegitimate or not, claiming your brother's name and home must have terrified you." Harriet looked away. "He was trying to write a letter that night," Miss Marple continued. "To Tom. But I think you intercepted it." Harriet's hands twitched slightly in her lap. "He said he would confess everything on Easter Monday, that he would stand before the congregation and speak the truth. About the marriage, about Margaret, even the possibility that Tom might be his son. And you couldn't let that happen." "I only gave him the tea," Harriet whispered. "He asked for it. I'd crushed a sleeping tonic into it. I didn't mean for it to kill him, just to give me time. I thought I could convince him to keep it quiet. I thought, if he could rest, if he would delay. But the dosage was too high." She nodded. "I took it from an old prescription. I didn't realize it had degraded or changed. I never meant—" Miss Marple didn't speak. There was no need. The pieces now aligned. Harriet's motive was fear, not of disgrace alone, but of losing the legacy, the memory, the control she had preserved all these years. She had thought she could pause time, but in doing so, she had ended a man's life and opened the very floodgate she feared most. Inspector Pritchard took Harriet Chiswell into custody that evening, with a tight jaw and the reluctant relief of a man who believed the case was finally put to rest. Her confession, recorded and signed, was straightforward in motive and method. The sleeping tonic, the intercepted letter, the panic, everything aligned with the timeline. The coroner confirmed that the compound in the Reverend's bloodstream matched the contents of the old bottle found hidden beneath Harriet's bed. The village, starved of resolution and uneasy with ambiguity, exhaled together. Here, at last, was a narrative they could understand. Grief twisted into fear. Pride tipping into quiet tragedy. The vicar had died at the hands of his own sister, and now the order of things could be restored. Miss Marple, however, felt no such comfort. She stood at the edge of the garden after the constable's car pulled away with Harriet in the back seat, her knitting forgotten in her handbag, her gaze fixed not on the house but on the crumbling wall where she had found the tin box. Something gnawed at her, something too quiet to name, too slippery to hold. Harriet's confession was logical, but it was also too convenient. It explained the method, yes, and the motive on the surface, but not the details that still pricked at the corners of her thoughts. Why had the Reverend been holding the hymn book so tightly? Why hide the letter if he planned to confess? Why, above all, had the note in the hymn book not been in his own hand? The next morning, the bishop's office sent word that an interim vicar would be arriving within the week, and Inspector Pritchard, satisfied that his work was complete, began preparing his final report. He offered Miss Marple a warm handshake and a quiet word of admiration for her insight. She accepted it politely, but her thoughts had already moved elsewhere. She returned once more to the church, empty now except for the echo of footsteps. She climbed the pulpit, gazing over the rows of polished pews, then down at the worn lectern. She imagined Reverend Chiswell standing there on Easter morning, eyes flicking not to the faces before him, but to the pages of his hymnal, as if expecting something more than comfort, something buried. She took down the book, the same old copy Elsie had spoken of, and leafed through it once again. Hymn 174, hymn 142, hymn 93. Her fingers paused over the dog-eared pages, following the underlines and faint notations. And then she saw it, just before the index, a faint tear at the binding. Something had been sewn in, then pulled free. Later that day, she found Elsie in the pantry, polishing silverware with more energy than the task demanded. Miss Marple took a seat beside her. "Elsie, I'd like you to think very carefully. Do you remember seeing the Reverend write anything in the hymn book the day before he died?" Elsie hesitated. "No, miss. He always read it, but never wrote in it." "And the note that was found inside, did you recognize the handwriting?" Elsie blinked. "Well, now that you mention it, no, it didn't look like his, but I didn't think to say anything. I assumed, yes, everyone did." Back at home, Miss Marple opened her notebook again, turning over the known elements. Harriet's confession, while believable, didn't account for the forged note. It didn't explain the man who called himself Benton, or the torn section inside the hymn book binding. Most importantly, it didn't explain the scent in the Reverend's study, the sweet, slightly synthetic perfume that had clung to the air. Not a sleeping tonic, not flowers, something else entirely. She sent a note to Inspector Pritchard that evening requesting a quiet re-examination of the Reverend's belongings, particularly the study chair and desk drawers. The inspector, still riding the satisfaction of a closed case, was slow to respond, but by the following afternoon he appeared at her door, grave and tight-lipped. "We missed something," he admitted. "Under the cushion of the Reverend's chair we found a small vial, glass, dark brown, hidden in the lining. Traces match a compound not present in the tonic, something more potent. A neurotoxin, delivered through skin contact most likely. The coroner is reviewing the original findings." Miss Marple closed her eyes. So he didn't drink it. Or, if he did, it wasn't what killed him. Pritchard looked visibly shaken. Harriet's confession might have been false, or rather half-true. She may have drugged the tea, yes, but something else, someone else, finished the job. The inspector now had to decide whether to release Harriet or dig deeper. But Miss Marple was already ahead of him. She knew now that someone had used Harriet's fear as a smokescreen, pushed her just enough to act irrationally, to intervene too early, and then built their plan around her mistake. A more calculated mind had slipped in behind the curtain. That night, Miss Marple requested a quiet word with Mrs. Penelope Drew. They sat together in the parlour with the windows open to the spring air. Miss Marple spoke softly, but directly. "I've been wondering, Mrs. Drew, about the man you said asked about the parish records." Mrs. Drew nodded too quickly. "Yes, of course. He was very interested, eager. And yet you never mentioned him until others had." Mrs. Drew's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "That he wasn't asking about records at all. That perhaps he came looking for something else, something in the Reverend's possession, something you knew about." Penelope stood abruptly, chin high. "I don't care for your implication, but you cared very much for the Reverend, didn't you?" Miss Marple said gently. "You visited often. You were one of the last to see him alive. You even mentioned how tightly he held his hymn book. A small thing to notice, unless you were looking for it." A long pause stretched. Mrs. Drew sat down again, but more slowly this time. "He never told me the full truth, just fragments. About Margaret, about the boy. But I saw what it would do. To the church, to him, to us all. And so you tried to stop it." "I thought Harriet would be enough," Penelope said quietly. "She would delay him, give me time to get the letter he wrote. I'd planned to destroy it before he could speak. But then I realized he'd already hidden it, somewhere. I thought it might be in the hymn book." "So you searched?" "Yes. I went back after service, while the others were still talking outside. Found the edge of it stitched into the binding, but he came back early. I panicked. I used the vial," Miss Marple sighed, "and left the false note as a trail." "I had to protect the church," Penelope said, eyes wild now. "He was going to ruin everything. Do you understand what it would have meant?" Miss Marple stood. "Yes, Mrs. Drew, I do understand. But that doesn't make it any less a crime." As dawn crept over Nether Farthing, the inspector returned once more to the vicarage, this time for a different arrest. The case, thought closed, had turned a corner, the village would whisper again. But now, with unease instead of relief, for the true danger had not come from scandal or disgrace, but from the fear of truth itself, and the desperate measures taken to silence it. Miss Marple, as always, had simply listened. Not to the loudest voices, but to the quiet ones, the contradictions, the tremors beneath ordinary words. And there, as ever, she had found the truth waiting to be heard. As Mrs. Drew was escorted from the vicarage by Inspector Pritchard, the villagers who had grown so comfortable with their tidy resolution watched in silent unease. The sudden shift, Harriet's confession dismissed, a new suspect taken in, rattled the carefully rebuilt calm of Nether Farthing. But for Miss Marple, the puzzle still hadn't locked into place. Penelope Drew had acted to silence the Reverend, yes. Her fear of scandal, of moral collapse within the church she'd devoted herself to, was real and dangerous. But something about her panic, her urgency, had felt more personal than institutional. It wasn't only about preserving the church's image, it had been about hiding something far deeper, something older. That night, Miss Marple sat again at her window, a fresh pot of tea untouched beside her, as the wind stirred the hedge outside. Her eyes rested not on her knitting or her notebook, but on the photograph of Margaret Benton, the same one recovered from the tin box. The woman's eyes held something stubborn in their softness, as if she'd known full well what she was walking into when she married Edmund Chiswell. There was a strength in her gaze, a steadiness, and it reminded Miss Marple of something she'd seen once before, decades earlier, during a case she'd helped resolve in Bracknell. A similar face, framed in trial photographs. Different woman, same sharp eyes. Miss Marple reached into her drawer and pulled out a worn folder. She kept records, clippings, odd little notices, some of them decades old. It took her an hour to find what she was looking for. A yellowed newspaper article dated 1919, its ink faded but legible. Local girl disappears after inquest. The girl's name had been Clara Benton. Her mother had been accused of theft. Her father had taken his own life after a scandal involving forged documents. The girl, no older than 15, had vanished. Before the courts could place her in guardianship, she had never been found. Miss Marple stared at the name again. Benton. Not Margaret, but Clara. Could it be? The next morning, she called in a quiet favour with the parish clerk, requesting access to the earliest employment records held at the church. "I just need to confirm something about the choir staff," she said gently. "A matter of local history." The records came in an envelope tied with twine. Miss Marple flicked through the pages until she found what she needed. A note from 1920, listing a Clara B., hired as a cleaner for St. Edward's Church, under the vicar before Chiswell. No address, no additional surname. But the signature was unmistakable. Her handwriting matched the forged note in the hymn book exactly. Not Margaret Benton, Clara Benton. A woman with something to hide and an entire identity to reconstruct. She had become Penelope Drew. The revelation narrowed everything. Clara Benton had vanished from the public record only to reappear in Nether Farthing under a new name, where she eventually rose from cleaner to choir mistress, embedding herself so deeply in the church that no one thought to question her past. And now she had murdered to protect a secret buried for over 40 years. But why? Why not simply disappear again as she had before? Miss Marple returned to the vicarage not to question but to reflect. She stepped again into the garden, walking slowly to the wall, where the tin box had been buried. She studied the ground, now closed and neat, and then turned to the side path where Tom Abbott had first spoken of his mother. That thread still hung loose. He had believed himself an orphan. The Reverend had shown him kindness, but if Penelope, Clara, had known him to be her grandson, or perhaps even her son, that would change everything. The question now was not only who had committed the murder, but how many lives had been built atop forgotten truths. She sought out Tom later that day, finding him in the graveyard, trimming hedges with mechanical determination. She watched him work for a moment before approaching. "Tom," she said gently, "may I ask you something very personal?" He glanced up, his face guarded. "I suppose. You never knew your mother. Do you know what happened to her?" "Only what the orphanage told me. She left me there when I was born. No name, no letter. I've always assumed she died." Miss Marple nodded. "Would you like to know who she was?" He stared at her. "What do you mean?" "I believe your mother was Margaret Benton, and I believe your grandmother, though she never told you, is Mrs. Drew. Her real name was Clara Benton." He looked at her as if she'd spoken in another language. "But that can't be." "It can. And I think that when Reverend Chiswell realized who you were, he began trying to piece the truth together himself. But Clara, Penelope, was already several steps ahead. She had lived a whole life pretending Margaret had vanished. Perhaps she even blamed the Reverend for what happened to Margaret, if she had died in hardship, in poverty, or worse. Or perhaps she simply feared that if you learned the truth, the life she had carefully built would be destroyed. Tom sat down on the low stone wall, his face pale. "So, all this time, she was there, right in front of me. She may even have believed she was protecting you by keeping silent. But that silence turned to fear when she realized the Reverend might expose it. Tom was silent a long time. Then he said, "If she did it, why lie about it? Why confess now?" Miss Marple didn't answer at once. Instead, she looked across the graves, row upon row of names and stories, most forgotten except for the stone that bore them. Because fear is a heavy burden. It changes people. It turns secrets into monsters. And when someone threatens to shine a light on them, even the most devoted woman can do something desperate. By the time evening fell, Inspector Pritchard had reopened the old file from Harriet's confession, this time cross-referencing handwriting samples and court records with a fresh lens. When presented with the new theory, Clara Benton's hidden identity, her relation to Tom, and her presence in the Reverend's life as both threat and secret keeper, it began to fit. Penelope Drew, as she had called herself, had never truly left her past. She had built a shrine over it and called it faith. Her interrogation the following day was short. Faced with the old documents, she neither denied nor confirmed. She simply said, "I never wanted him to suffer. I just couldn't let him speak." Her tone held no triumph, only exhaustion. And in the quiet that followed, the final truth settled. The murder of Reverend Chiswell was not born of one moment or one poison. It was the slow culmination of a lie lived too long, of a grief unspoken, of bloodlines twisted in shame. It was a shadow stretching from the past into the present, and in that shadow, all of Nether Farthing stood a little more quietly than before. The confession of Mrs. Drew, Clara Benton, had cast a heavy silence over the village, the sort of silence that lingered not from shock, but from exhaustion. For those who had known her only as the devoted choir mistress, the idea of her as both a liar and a killer fractured something fundamental in the illusion of respectability. Yet for Miss Marple, that silence was not quite satisfying. Clara had admitted her role in silencing Reverend Chiswell, and the evidence supported her confession. But still, something held her attention fast, like a song played in the wrong key. There had been too many layers, too many hands brushing the edges of the truth. And most troubling of all was Mr. Benton, the man who had arrived in the weeks leading up to the murder, questioned so many, and then vanished again without leaving a single trace. His presence was like a smudge on a window, not enough to see through, but impossible to ignore. Miss Marple, ever cautious about reaching a conclusion too soon, decided to press a little further, not with questions but with something subtler. She asked Inspector Pritchard to quietly circulate a notice, ostensibly for archival purposes, inviting anyone who had attended St. Edward's in the 1910s or 1920s to contribute letters or photographs of the church to the parish records. She knew well how memories clung to paper, and how the act of remembering often loosened lips that wouldn't move for direct interrogation. It was not evidence she sought. It was inconsistency. Within a day, several villagers brought forward old photos, hymn lists and even dried flowers pressed into church bulletins. But it was Mrs. Abernathy, a widowed schoolteacher now mostly confined to her garden chair, who provided something truly unexpected. Wrapped in a piece of muslin cloth, she handed Miss Marple a faded photograph and said, "Found it in my husband's old box of war letters. Must have been taken just before he shipped out. That's the old vicar on the left. And that's Edmund, young then, of course. And her, that's the one. Margaret, the one with the eyes." Miss Marple took the photo carefully. There were 3 people standing near the church doors, an older vicar with a crooked collar, Edmund Chiswell in his 20s, and a woman in a cloche hat with dark eyes and a distant smile. But it was the man standing behind them, half in shadow, that caught her attention. He wore no robes, no choir vest, but stood close, too close to be a stranger, and his face, partly obscured, was oddly familiar. The shape of his jaw, the posture, the way his left hand was curled into a partial fist. She returned to her sitting room, and retrieved the scrap of paper found inside the hymn book, the one with the partial note, "I never meant to, behind the garden wall. Forgive me." It had been written in a hasty, uneven hand, but the looped letters and exaggerated tails on the Y and G were distinctive. She compared it now with the envelope Benton had delivered, different handwriting, yet both seemed strained, forced, like someone trying not to write in their usual way. It occurred to her then that perhaps the man calling himself Benton had forged both, and perhaps he wasn't Benton at all. The next morning, she asked Inspector Pritchard to gather the known suspects and church staff for a final discussion, not under the banner of interrogation, but in the guise of a community resolution. "Let us sit together," she said, "to remember Reverend Chiswell, to speak freely and close the matter with dignity." It was to take place in the parish hall, with tea and chairs arranged in a circle, just as they might for a church social. Miss Marple was careful to invite everyone, Harriet, Tom, Croot, Elsie, Welch, and even the groundsman. But she also left an open chair and announced very deliberately that she hoped Mr. Benton would join them, as the Reverend's last known visitor. The effect was instant. Several faces turned at once, but it was Lionel Croot who reacted most curiously. He dropped his teaspoon into his saucer with a sharp clink and reached quickly for his napkin, pressing it to his lips though he hadn't taken a bite. Miss Marple filed the moment away. She waited until everyone was seated and the murmur of polite conversation had settled before speaking. "Before we begin our remembrances," she said gently, "I would like to play a short recording. I hope you'll indulge me. It's something rather odd I found." She produced a small gramophone, an old portable model that had belonged to her nephew. On the turntable was a recording she'd borrowed from the county archives, an oral history tape recorded by a local historian in the 1950s. The voice was rough, male, and in the middle of a recollection. And then Edmund said, "Lionel, if you ever come near her again, I'll go to the bishop myself." But Lionel just laughed, said, "You haven't the stomach for scandal." Miss Marple turned off the gramophone. Silence fell. Lionel Croot sat still, but the colour had drained from his face. "Where did you get that?" he asked, voice tight. "I didn't," Miss Marple said. "I made it up. There is no tape, but you just confirmed it for me." There was a pause, a breathless one, before Croot stood sharply. "This is absurd. Trickery. I won't be part of some theatrical display." "No?" she asked. "Then why react so strongly? You see, I suspected that you, not Mr. Benton, were the final piece. That photograph Mrs. Abernathy gave me, there's a man in the background who looks rather like you. You were older then, perhaps in your early 20s, and you knew Margaret Benton far better than you admitted. I believe you loved her, or believed you did. But when she married Edmund, something in you turned." Croot was shaking now. "She was meant to leave with me, not with him. And when she didn't, you told everyone she ran off. But you knew where she went, didn't you?" "She didn't die," he said suddenly. "She didn't vanish. He locked her away. She went to a sanatorium in Surrey. He paid for it." "Because she was pregnant?" Croot nodded. "Yes. And when he found out, he told her she'd ruin everything. I confronted him once, years later. He denied the child was his, but I knew he was lying. So when this man, this so-called Mr. Benton, came to the village asking questions, you realized your lies might finally be exposed. I thought he was bluffing, just someone digging for inheritance. I never thought he'd bring her memory back. I couldn't let him open that box." "Then why not kill him?" Miss Marple asked very softly. Croot's eyes were glassy. "Because it wasn't him. It was Edmund, still lying, still covering, still deciding what to bury. So I did what he had always feared. I gave him what he denied Margaret. No mercy." He slumped back into his chair. By the time the constable arrived, Croot had said nothing more. Miss Marple stood, quietly beside the empty teacups, the gramophone still on the table. The room buzzed with confused whispers, but she heard none of them. What echoed in her mind instead was that half-written confession, the one never signed, never finished. She realized now that it hadn't been meant for the Reverend to find. It had been left for someone else entirely. A message not from guilt, but from the man who'd finally acted after years of resentment. Crout's crime had not been born of greed or fear, but from the slow, festering ache of a life spent shadowing another man's sins. And in the end, it was not the poison, nor the paper trail, but one small lie spoken aloud that undid him. Lionel Crout's arrest sent shockwaves through nether farthing that ran deeper than the earlier upheaval. This time there was no moral ambiguity to soften the blow. Crout had confessed plainly, his face pale with fury and regret, his words laying bare the festering jealousy and long-nursed betrayal that had driven him to murder. The village, once eager for resolution, now recoiled in stunned silence as, if realizing that the poison had not come from outside but had grown slowly in their midst, fed by secrets, pride, and proximity. Inspector Pritchard, exhausted but determined, spent the next morning cataloguing the evidence for a formal charge. Miss Marple, though calm in manner, remained unsettled. Something about Crout's confession hadn't sat cleanly. The motive was real, the bitterness genuine, and the photograph confirmed his early connection to Margaret Benton. Yet it still felt like a rope pulled taut with one knot missing, an odd slack in the middle of an otherwise tight cord. There had been too many players, too many letters and fragments that now, under scrutiny, hinted at another pair of hands somewhere behind the curtain. Late that afternoon, Pritchard stopped by Miss Marple's cottage. His expression was taut. "The tin box," he said. "It's gone." She looked up from her knitting. "Gone?" "Stolen. From the evidence locker at the parish hall. We were storing the smaller items there temporarily before transfer to county. The key was accounted for. The lock untouched. But the box is gone. The letter, the wedding certificate, the photograph. All of it." Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "That wasn't Lionel." "No," Pritchard said grimly. "He's still in holding, under supervision. This was someone else. Someone with just enough knowledge to know exactly what that box contained, and what it threatened, and how to take it without being noticed," he added. They stood in silence for a moment, the implications thick between them. With the tin box missing, the link between Chiswell and Margaret Benton could no longer be proven. The letter, the Reverend's own words gone, the photograph, the marriage certificate, the symbolic evidence that confirmed Crout's claims and, more importantly, exposed the full lineage connecting Tom Abbott to Margaret, all vanished. And that, Miss Marple realized, was the point. Next day she walked the garden paths of the village with deliberate slowness, letting her thoughts settle like dust on old furniture. She visited the church briefly, stepping once more into the pulpit where the sun now poured clean through the stained glass and the hymn book lay open and ordinary. The calm of the scene was almost cruel in its contrast. She stepped down and wandered past the choir stalls, running her fingers along the polished wood, and paused at the vestry door. It was locked now, as it had not always been, and she stared at it a long moment before continuing to the back. At the small tea room next to the church hall, she found Elsie cleaning silverware again. She looked up when Miss Marple entered, nervous and tired. "Is it true," she asked, "that Mr. Crout did it?" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "but I think there's more to it. Someone else is still hiding something. That tin box meant a great deal to someone, enough to risk stealing it." Elsie's hands paused. "Do you think it was Mrs. Drew? She's in custody now. But perhaps someone connected to her, or someone else who knew what was in that box and wanted it silenced." Elsie looked uncertain. I saw someone go into the parish hall last night." I didn't think anything of it. I was walking home past the back lane. I only caught a glimpse. Did you recognize them? No. They had a coat pulled up high and kept to the shadows, but they moved quickly, like they knew where they were going. Miss Marple nodded. It wasn't much, but it confirmed that the theft had been planned, likely by someone familiar with the hall's layout and the habits of those who passed by. That narrowed it down to the church staff, or someone who had been part of the investigation, or, more troublingly, someone who had been watching the investigation closely without ever stepping into the spotlight. That evening she paid a quiet visit to Tom Abbott. She found him sitting outside the groundskeeper's shed, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the gravestones beyond the wall. When she greeted him, he didn't look up right away. "I heard about the box," he said. "Gone." "Yes," he frowned. "Why would anyone want it? It's just a photo and some paper." "It's what they represent," she said softly. "Your mother's marriage to the Reverend. The confirmation of your connection." He stared. Out again. "So now it's all gone. There's nothing left to prove anything. I'm back where I started." She studied him closely. "That bothers you?" He hesitated. "I don't know. It's strange. I wanted the truth. And now I've got pieces. Just enough to know, but not enough to show anyone else." "You feel robbed of something?" Tom looked at her then. "Do you think I took it?" "No," she said, and watched the relief flicker too fast. "But I think you know who did." He didn't speak. "Tom," she said quietly, "you've worked here long enough to know where everything is kept. If someone asked you where the evidence was stored, or even just hinted, they wouldn't need to break in. Just wait for the right moment." He rubbed his hands over his face. "I didn't steal it." "But you helped someone who did." He sat in silence. Then, she said she didn't mean to kill him, that she was trying to stop him from hurting me. She thought he'd deny it again, that he'd make me out a liar, that everyone would believe him. Miss Marple's voice was very still. "You mean Mrs. Drew?" He nodded. "She told me just before they took her. Said she tried to protect me, and now everything would be twisted. I didn't want to lose the last of it. I didn't want her story ripped apart in court. I didn't want to be a footnote in someone else's scandal." "So you took the box?" "No, but I told her where it was. And when she didn't come back, I thought maybe someone else got to it first." Miss Marple placed a hand gently on his arm. "That box didn't make you who you are, Tom. It doesn't erase the kindness Chiswell showed you, nor the pain Clara, Mrs. Drew, tried to cover with lies. But hiding the truth, even to preserve someone's image, only ever deepens the damage. The next morning, the parish hall's lock was found broken, not forced, but picked, and tucked beneath the altar cloth in the chapel, wrapped in a plain towel, was the tin box, intact, untouched. Inspector Pritchard looked at Miss Marple in confusion. "But who returned it?" "I suspect," she said, "that Tom left it there after thinking it through. Perhaps he saw that truth, however painful, was safer in the open than hidden one more time." Pritchard examined the contents, then sighed. "Still admissible, still real." "Yes," she said. "And now perhaps we're nearly at the end." But in her mind, she still held on to one missing thread, the note in the hymn book, a clue left behind before the Reverend's death, written by a hand that didn't belong to any of the known suspects. And that meant the shadows still held one final voice, quiet and watching, waiting for all the rest to fall into place. Return of the tin box brought a temporary calm to Netherfarthing. Inspector Pritchard, though cautious, considered it a gesture of conscience, perhaps from Tom, perhaps from someone else wrestling with guilt. He placed it under lock and key once more, this time in his own office, away from parish grounds. The box, with its brittle photograph, worn certificate, and folded letter seemed to have completed its journey. But Miss Marple remained uneasy. It was not just the missing handwriting in the hymn book that troubled her, nor the long chain of deception that had wrapped the Reverend's life in knots. It was the silence, a silence that now felt artificial, too still, like a pause before the next sound, something not yet finished. 2 days later, that silence broke. The news came just before sunrise, carried in the frantic footsteps of a milkman who stumbled upon the body behind the vestry. Elsie Dodd, the vicarage maid, had not returned home the night before. She now lay face down on the flagstones behind the church, her arms tucked awkwardly beneath her, as though she'd collapsed mid-flight. There were no visible wounds, no signs of a struggle, just the faintest bruising along her throat and the broken clasp of a handbag nearby, contents scattered. Lipstick, handkerchief, a key, and a folded sheet of paper. Inspector Pritchard arrived. Within the hour, jaw clenched, his coat still unbuttoned in haste. He cordoned off the area and began collecting statements, but there was little to go on. No one had heard anything. No one had seen anyone enter or leave. The back of the church, shielded by trees and shielded further by indifference, had become the site of a second crime. And this time, there was no clear suspect, no confession, no motive that fit. Miss Marple arrived just before the coroner, her expression unreadable. She stood over Elsie's body, not out of morbid curiosity, but with the same stillness she brought to her garden in early spring, waiting to see which shoots would bloom and which had withered. Then she bent, gently picked up the paper that had fallen from Elsie's bag and handed it to Pritchard without a word. It was a torn page from a church guest ledger, one that had been missing since the original investigation. Across the top were 5 names, some familiar, some not. And next to each, a date. April 5th, April 6th, April 7th. The final name was underlined in pencil, Jonathan B. Tremaine. And below it, in a shakier hand, 2 words, not Benton. Pritchard stared at it. Tremaine? That wasn't the name he gave. No, Miss Marple said softly. He called himself Benton. But this proves what I feared. The man who questioned the Reverend wasn't related to Margaret Benton at all. He wasn't her son. He used the name to gain sympathy, to open doors, to shake people, and it worked. But why? I believe Elsie found out, Miss Marple replied, or at least suspected. Perhaps she recognized the handwriting on the note in the hymn book, or maybe she remembered a face. Either way, she tried to tell someone, possibly Tom, but she wasn't fast enough. They examined the church guest log. Tremaine's name appeared only once, in the week before Easter. No address, no notes, just the signature. Miss Marple requested a copy of the records from the neighbouring village of Marshwood, where Tremaine had reportedly stopped during his search for family history. The vicar there confirmed the visit, but, more disturbingly, added that the man had inquired about a different church entirely, under a different name. Back in Netherfarthing, Tom Abbott was nowhere to be found. Pritchard's constables combed the village, but his room was empty and no one had seen him since the previous evening. A note left behind read only, "I went to find him. I have to know." There was no signature, just a time written in the corner. Midnight. Miss Marple stood in Tom's room, eyes on the note, her mind racing. "He's not running," she said. "He's chasing." "You think he knows who Tremaine really is?" "I think he suspects," she said. "And worse, I believe Tremaine wants him to." The Reverend's death had never been the endgame. Clara's confession, Croot's rage, both had served as convenient distractions. Tremaine, whoever he truly was, had orchestrated a much larger deception. He'd sown unrest, forged identities, whispered old truths twisted just enough to fit his needs. And now, with the Reverend gone, the only person who might lead to the truth was Tom. Miss Marple paced the vicarage garden. Her mind pressed every detail like a fingerprint. Tremaine's forged identity, the note planted in the hymn book, the missing ledger page. He had inserted himself into the past, rewriting history for reasons no one yet understood. But Elsie's murder had changed everything. That hadn't been part of the smokescreen. That was personal, urgent. She'd stumbled onto something Tremaine couldn't afford to have known. And now Tom was out there, alone, hunting a man who had killed twice to protect his illusion. Miss Marple turned to Pritchard. "We need to check the train timetables. Marshwood, Wexby and Lower Warden. If he's luring Tom into a remote spot, it'll be somewhere off the main road. He's orchestrating a finale." Pritchard didn't hesitate. Orders were dispatched, notices sent. But dusk came again with no sign of Tom. Then, just before midnight, a call came through. A night porter at the old Priory house on the edge of Lower Warden reported 2 men entering the grounds, one young, one older. He described the older man as wearing a dark coat, moving confidently, as if he knew the place. The younger followed reluctantly. They had entered just before sunset and not come out. Miss Marple was already putting on her coat. By the time they arrived, the wind had picked up, and clouds rolled thick above the old Priory. The grounds were quiet. Too quiet. Inside, they found one lamp lit in the main hall. On a desk sat a stack of documents. Letters, some real, some false. A photograph of Margaret Benton had been laid carefully in the centre, and beside it, a worn pistol, cold to the touch. Tom stood in the corridor beyond, blood trickling from a small cut above his eye. He looked up as Pritchard approached. "He tried to make me believe it," Tom said quietly. "That he was my uncle, that he'd come to give me the truth. But he didn't want truth. He wanted to erase it." "And where is he now?" Miss Marple asked. Tom turned toward the rear stairwell. "He ran when I called him out. Said I reminded him too much of her. Said I was the reason she died. They found Tremaine in the chapel, ruins behind the Priory, collapsed beside a broken altar, a head wound from a fall. Still breathing, but barely. In his pocket were false documents, passports under 3 names, and a locket containing a portrait, not of Margaret Benton, but of a woman never mentioned before. Miss Marple looked at it long and hard. "That's not Margaret." "No," Pritchard said. "Then who?" "I don't know," she said, "but I suspect this story isn't quite finished." And just like that, the case twisted once more, not ending, but opening its final door. The rain began falling in, thin, whispering sheets as dawn broke over the Priory grounds, casting everything in a pale silver. Tremaine, unconscious but alive, had been taken under guard to the hospital in Wexby, where the doctors expressed cautious optimism. Tom Abbott, though shaken, had refused treatment beyond a bandage and a cup of strong tea. He sat in silence. In the main hall of the Priory, his hands pressed together tightly, the portrait found in Tremaine's coat still resting beside him. It was the only item not locked away with the rest of the man's false documents. Miss Marple stood near the long, arched window, watching the way the rain threaded its way through the cracks in the old stone. The locket had puzzled her. The woman inside it was unfamiliar, round-faced, modestly dressed, unremarkable in every way except her eyes. There was a sadness in them, a resignation that lingered longer than any trace of vanity. It wasn't Margaret Benton, of that she was sure. But someone had mattered deeply to Tremaine, enough for him to carry her image through his deception. It wasn't sentimentality, it was motivation, and it tugged at something she hadn't yet been able to name. Pritchard joined her, soaked from the dash back from the village. Tremaine's stable, for now. But no confession yet. When he woke briefly, he only asked for his coat. "Of course he did," Miss Marple murmured. "We've got everything he was carrying, all aliases, all the papers." But we still don't know who he actually is. Nothing real on him at all. He told Tom he was his uncle. Pritchard nodded. Another lie. Not necessarily, she said. But the connection isn't through Margaret. It's through someone else. She turned back to the room, her eyes landing once again on the small pile of scattered documents. One of them, a hand-typed letter of reference, still sat where it had been dropped the night before. She picked it up, turned it over, and studied the letterhead. It bore the emblem of a women's convalescent home in Surrey. Not the sanatorium where Margaret had been committed, but a sister institution across the county line. The name beneath the letterhead was unfamiliar. Rose Halberton. She stared at the name for a long time, then turned to Pritchard. Do you remember the detail from the first letter found in the hymn book? The one that began, "I never meant to," and ended behind the garden wall. Forgive me? Yes. Handwriting didn't match Chiswell's or Clara's. We assumed it was forged. Perhaps it wasn't forged, she said, just disguised. I think we've been assuming that the Reverend was the center of everything, but what if he wasn't? What if the key wasn't who killed him, but who drew him into hiding in the first place? Pritchard frowned. You think it's this Halberton woman? I think she may be the thread we've missed. And I think Tremaine's real identity is tied to her, not to Margaret. They spent the rest of the morning pulling records, birth registries, hospital admissions, even the old employment lists from the convalescent home. And there, under a May 1919 entry, it appeared. Rose Halberton, domestic staff, dismissed after incident involving patient disturbance. No details listed, no address given. But in the notes column, a scribbled sentence, transferred to admin position at Marshwood Church under recommendation of E. Chiswell. Miss Marple sat back in her chair. That's it. That's what's been bothering me. Pritchard looked confused. What is? The handwriting, she said. I saw it in the old marriage register once when we checked for Margaret's certificate. One of the entries was penned in the same style, those wide looping Ys, the flared Gs. It wasn't the vicar's hand. It was the assistant, Rose Halberton. She must have handled records during her post at the church. Pritchard leaned forward. So you're saying she wrote the note in the hymn book? I'm saying she tried to warn him, or perhaps warn someone else. And Tremaine, whoever he really is, was connected to her. Perhaps her son, perhaps her brother. And when she disappeared, or was silenced, he spent years trying to trace it all back to Edmund Chiswell. But why now? Because the Reverend was preparing to speak, she said, after decades of silence. And someone, Tremaine, had built his entire world on the belief that Chiswell had been the architect of his mother's destruction. And when the truth didn't match the story he'd created, he lashed out. Pritchard's voice dropped. Then, Elsie, she must have uncovered the connection, perhaps in an old letter or from something Tom said. But once she saw the real name, Halberton, it would have led her to question the Benton story, and that made her dangerous to Tremaine. Miss Marple walked slowly to the portrait again, picking it up with a kind of reverence. This woman wasn't Margaret. She was the forgotten one, a witness perhaps to Margaret's suffering, or maybe more. Maybe she loved Chiswell. Maybe she took the blame for something he couldn't confess to. Either way, Tremaine blamed him. And when the facts didn't align, he decided to rewrite them by force. Tom entered quietly, his footsteps slow and hesitant. He's not my uncle, he said. No, Miss Marple replied gently. But he thought he was saving you, or avenging you, or perhaps using you. Tom nodded. He told me stories about my mother, said Chiswell locked her away. But when I asked for proof, he showed me nothing, just looked at me like I was supposed to understand. He was chasing a ghost, she said, one built from fragments. but he underestimated the damage he'd cause once he stepped into the lives of people still living with the consequences. Pritchard exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. So where does that leave us? He's got no record, no past, no name. Miss Marple held up the letter with the Surrey address. It leaves us with a path. We follow Rose Halberton. If we find her, or what became of her, we'll find the truth. And that will lead us to who Tremaine really is. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the Priory wrapped in that strange stillness that follows a storm. Everything soaked, silent, but alive. The pattern had emerged at last, not through fingerprints or alibis, but through the slow stitching together of forgotten names and abandoned records. The key had always been there, waiting in plain sight, in the hymn book, in a faded signature, in the empty space where a woman once stood and was erased. Miss Marple knew now what they were truly investigating wasn't only a murder. It was a memory someone had fought very hard to bury and had killed to protect. The journey to uncover Rose Halberton's past led Miss Marple and Inspector Pritchard to a forgotten archive in a village library in Lower Marshwood, where the staff had long since stopped expecting visitors and had grown suspicious of anyone who opened the drawers marked confidential. But tucked into a faded binder of parish employment records, they found a Rose Halberton, employed as assistant clerk and record keeper for St Anne's Convalescent Home from 1918 to 1920, terminated with no formal explanation, replaced by a name typed hastily in the margin, no forwarding address. But then, in a second register, 1, kept unofficially by the chapel, she was listed again just once, Rose Halberton, choir attendant, December 1919, and next to it, in barely legible pencil, pregnant. No father listed, disappeared weeks later. Miss Marple stared at the word disappeared. It echoed across every other corner of this case. Margaret had vanished. Clara had hidden in plain sight. And now Rose, buried not in soil, but in clerical ink and omission. The deeper truth began to rise like mist over cold ground. Miss Marple asked for access to any personal correspondence left in storage from the sanatorium. It took time and persuasion, but eventually a locked tin box, another one, this one dusty and dented, was brought up from the basement. Among yellowed envelopes and ink-faded letters was one bearing the name R. Tremaine, addressed from a post office box in Bristol. It was dated March 1920. Inside, a single page, unsigned, written in a stiff and clipped tone. I was not given a choice. I cannot offer what you need. My name cannot be attached. You must not write again. Destroy this. Miss Marple held the page in silence. The pressure of its words was like a weight. It wasn't a lover's rejection, nor a coward's excuse. It was a command. And it confirmed everything. Rose had not disappeared. She had been erased. On the journey back, the pieces locked quietly into place. Tremaine wasn't avenging Margaret. He wasn't even pretending to anymore. That had only been the bait, something villagers could verify, a thread of truth twisted to gain trust. The real story was deeper, colder. And when Miss Marple finally stood once more beside Tremaine's hospital bed, the pieces settled with finality. He was awake now, propped up on pillows, his face pale and drawn. There was no fight in him, only that brittle stillness of someone who no longer feared being found out. I know who Rose Halberton was, Miss Marple said. I know what they did to her. I know that you are her son. His eyes didn't flicker, but his jaw set tighter. She worked quietly, never drew attention. The church trusted her to record its most intimate truths, but when she became inconvenient, pregnant, unmarried, they dismissed her. And when she tried to name the man responsible, she was silenced. You spent your life chasing the ghost of that silence. He looked away, eyes fixed on a speck in the far corner of the ceiling. You blamed Edmund Chiswell. He exhaled sharply. He was responsible. He put her away. She trusted him. He told her he would help. But he helped her. Disappear instead, Miss Marple spoke gently. He may have lied. He may even have failed her. But you didn't know that for certain until you met him. You only knew what you'd been told. And I gave him a chance to admit it, Tremaine said bitterly. I went to him. I asked directly. He looked me in the eye and said he'd never known a Rose Halberton, that my mother must have imagined it. He tried to tell me my mother was confused, hysterical, just like they all said. And so you poisoned him. I needed the world to hear her name. I wanted them to remember what they had chosen to forget. But they didn't, Miss Marple said. Not at first, because you didn't let them. You used Margaret Benton's name instead. You turned your revenge into a performance. His voice broke then, bitter and low. Because her name wouldn't have mattered. No one remembered her. No one wanted to remember her. But Margaret, they still whispered about her. I used it because it worked. It got me into the room. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So you became the ghost of one forgotten woman to avenge another. He didn't answer. You left the note in the hymn book, she said. You forged the tone, the shape, made it seem like a confession. I wanted him to feel it, he said, looking at her at last. Even if only for a day. I wanted him to sit in that chair and think of her, to wonder if it would surface. But you didn't expect others would get hurt, she said. Elsie, Tom. His eyes closed. Tom was a mistake. I thought he might understand, that maybe he'd help me. But then he asked too many questions, started wondering who I really was. And Elsie? He didn't speak. She found your real name on the ledger, Miss Marple said. And once she had that, it was only a matter of time. I followed her, he said softly, just to see if she'd talk. I didn't mean to. She turned around too fast. She grabbed me. I panicked. Miss Marple's voice was quiet but firm. It was never about justice. It was about making the pain louder than the silence. He said nothing. She stepped back. You won't be forgotten, but neither will she. That's the difference now. Outside, the clouds had broken apart, thin light filtering through over the hospital gardens. Inspector Pritchard waited in the corridor, arms folded. Well? He asked. He did it all, Miss Marple said, but not for money. Not even for revenge in the ordinary sense. Pritchard nodded grimly. So what do I write in the report? She looked past him, down the long hallway filled with footsteps of nurses and the low creak of medicine trolleys. Write that he killed because he couldn't bury her again, because the world had already done it once and he wouldn't allow it to happen a second time. And as they left the hospital, the rain did not return. Only a quiet, still morning followed, one that carried no forgiveness, but at least a kind of understanding. Miss Marple sat in her parlour that evening with the curtains drawn and the lamps low. Outside, the village of Netherfarthing seemed to be breathing again, slowly and unevenly, like someone waking from a long fever. The truth was mostly out now, layer upon layer peeled back to reveal not just a killer, but a history so thoroughly forgotten it had to be dragged into the present jagged and cold. But despite all that had been said and confessed, there was still one part left to be set right. A name still needed to be spoken in the proper light, and she intended to make sure it was. Inspector Pritchard had arranged the meeting at her suggestion. No arrests, no courtroom, no press. Just a gathering of those who had stood at the edge of the storm without ever understanding its centre. Tom Abbott, Harriet Chiswell, Lionel Crute, now released, charges dropped after further examination of his manipulated confession. Even Clara Benton, or Mrs. Drew as they had known her, was brought under escort from the remand centre. And Tremaine, pale and still walking, with difficulty was escorted in by two officers, his wrists unshackled for the occasion. They met in the vestry room under the dull brass light of the ceiling lamp, where the smell of polished wood mingled with dust and old wax. Miss Marple took her seat in the centre, her hands folded neatly, her voice quiet but steady. "I've brought you all here," she began, "not for justice that has already begun its slow course, but for truth, full truth. Because in this village, in this church, memory was treated like an inconvenience. And that, more than any poison or forged name, is what allowed murder to take root." She turned first to Tremaine. "You told yourself for years that Edmund Chiswell had taken everything from your mother, that his silence condemned her to madness or poverty or erasure. And when you found out he had lied about her existence, you saw only confirmation." He said nothing, his face stiff, eyes unreadable. "But you never confirmed the rest. You built your revenge around assumption, around pain that no one had ever helped you hold, still silence, and you used Margaret Benton's name to get close to him, because it opened doors, but that name cost others dearly." Tom shifted slightly in his seat, his jaw clenched. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to him. "You were caught between two legacies, the one they tried to hide from you, and the one Tremaine offered like a torch. But you didn't need either to know who you were. You only needed the truth." Tom looked down, his hands tight on his knees. "And then there is Mrs. Drew." Miss Marple turned slowly. "Clara, you tried to protect your son. You tried to preserve a church. But in doing so, you chose silence. You allowed Margaret's name to disappear. You watched Rose be cast aside." Clara flinched as if struck. "I was afraid," she said quietly. "There was no way to fix it once it had started." "You're right," Miss Marple replied. "But the danger wasn't in failing to fix it. It was in pretending it never happened." At last, she turned to Harriet. "And you, your brother trusted you with his final days. He hid the worst of his regrets beneath his robes. He wanted to speak at the end, but not to save his soul, to set one small thing straight, to say her name aloud." Harriet's eyes welled. He thought the past had passed, that it had no power anymore. But it still lived in every wall of that house. I think he knew that at the end. Miss Marple stood then, the room falling into a charged hush. "And now we will speak it properly. Rose Halberton, she was a record keeper, a servant, a young woman who became inconvenient. She was discarded without explanation. Her child was hidden, her death perhaps unmarked. But her name will not remain buried." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was reverent. For a moment, even Tremaine's shoulders dropped, his eyes losing their sharpness, the edges of his mask fraying, but it wasn't over. Not quite. Miss Marple took a step closer to him. "One thing still remains. You've lied under many names. You stole one, but you never gave us your own." He didn't answer. Pritchard stepped forward. "This is your last chance. The courts will ask. So will the press. You might control the story here for once, if you speak it now." Tremaine's voice came slowly, rasping. "I was registered as James Halberton, no father listed." Miss Marple nodded once solemnly. "Then, James, I want you to understand something. You did not fail your mother. You were failed by those who should have protected her. But revenge will never substitute remembrance. You wanted the world to know her story. You've done that. Now let the rest be peace." His eyes filled, not with tears, but with a fatigue so deep it seemed to hollow his entire frame. "Will they mark her grave?" he asked. "They will," Pritchard said. The meeting ended without ceremony. No one rushed out. No one lingered. Long. They left quietly, individually, returning to homes and memories, some softened, some raw. Only Miss Marple remained for a time, standing alone in the church, watching the sun slip through the high window, falling gently on the hymn book still resting on the lectern. She walked to it, opened it once more to hymn 174, "The day thou gavest, Lord, is ended," a verse underlined faintly. She whispered it to herself. As o'er each continent and island, the dawn leads on another day. She closed the book gently, straightened the cover, and stepped back. The pattern was complete now. The crimes, the silence, the names, all accounted for, but it was not a victory. It was something quieter, something heavier. The weight of a truth finally spoken aloud, no longer festering beneath layers of shame, but resting, still flawed, still painful, in the open. And in that silence, Miss Marple finally let it be. The days that followed were filled with quiet, activity, interviews, reports, final statements filed at the county office. James Halberton, now known properly by his name, was being transferred to a secure facility to await trial. The tin box containing Rose's final letters had been donated to the church archive, sealed with a notation that would, in time, become a footnote in the history of Nether Farthing. For most, it seemed the story was ending as all mysteries should, resolved, named, filed, and grieved. Miss Marple, though composed as always, walked the village lanes with a strange tension in her stride, as if her mind were holding something fragile that hadn't yet found its shape. One morning, as she made her usual visit to the church to place flowers beneath the brass plaque now dedicated to Rose Halberton, simple, without dates, she noticed something curious. A hymn book had been removed from the lectern and left resting on the pew nearby. It wasn't the one traditionally used by the vicar or Reverend Chiswell. It was older, bound in cracked green leather, the spine warped. Miss Marple opened it slowly. There, tucked into the inside cover, was a folded slip of paper, no more than a few inches wide, torn roughly along one side. She recognized the handwriting. Immediately, I was wrong. She wasn't silenced. She was protected. The message bore no date, no name, but it was in Edmund Chiswell's hand. Miss Marple stood absolutely still, every muscle in her body stilled by the sudden knowledge that the resolution they had all accepted had missed something vital, something the Reverend had tried, in the end, to put right in secret. The note had likely been hidden before his death, too carefully placed to be found without intention, and now, staring at it in the full morning light, she understood. Chiswell had not merely been a weak man caught in a moral tangle. He had known, more than he admitted. Perhaps not guilty of the crimes James believed, but not innocent either. His silence had protected someone. The question was who? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple laid the note beside the parish registers she'd requested a week earlier, now freshly delivered. She flipped to the records from 1920 and looked again at the entries around Rose Halberton's employment. There it was. 2 names listed beneath hers on the same page, Clara Benton and Harriet Chiswell, both marked as volunteer aides, listed under temporary staffing. She'd seen it before, but it had seemed a coincidence. Not now. She stared at the page for several minutes. Clara, she already knew, had been part of the cover-up, helping erase Margaret, hide Tom's origins. But Harriet, the spinster sister, always proper, always in the background, had she been complicit too? She walked to the vicarage, her shoes silent on the gravel path. Harriet had returned there in the days after everything settled, sorting her brother's belongings and preparing the house for its eventual new tenant. When Miss Marple knocked, she opened the door calmly, even pleasantly. "I thought we were done with secrets," Miss Marple said. Harriet's smile held. Aren't we? No. I found the note Edmund left, the one he hid in the green hymn book. Harriet blinked, just once. I don't know anything about a green hymn book. Of course you do, Miss Marple replied. You were there in 1920, you and Clara. You were both present when Rose disappeared. You weren't protecting the church, you were protecting someone closer. For the first time, the calm began to fray. Harriet turned from the doorway and walked slowly into the sitting room. Miss Marple followed. You always spoke of Edmund as if he were faultless, she said. But there was always a quiet tension. Behind it, it wasn't loyalty, it was guilt. He wasn't trying to protect himself at the end. He was protecting you. Harriet sat down, very slowly. You have no proof. I have a note, Miss Marple said, and a pattern. Rose Halberton vanished just after your temporary post ended. Edmund arranged her transfer, but the note makes clear he didn't silence her. He shielded her. From what or whom? Harriet's fingers clenched the armrest. She was going to name me, she said suddenly, quietly. She was angry. She saw me with someone. One of the churchmen. She assumed I'd seduced him. Or worse. But it wasn't like that. She threatened to tell Edmund I'd endangered the reputation of the church. She didn't understand. She saw you vulnerable, Miss Marple said. And you were terrified she'd tell someone. She was going to ruin me, Harriet said, her voice rising slightly. I was young. I had just returned from a failed courtship. I volunteered at the home to prove my usefulness. And she, Rose, was always there watching, judging. So you and Clara made her disappear? No, Harriet said. Clara did. I only told her what happened. She said she'd take care of it. I thought she meant she'd talk to her, reason with her. But the next day, Rose was gone. And Edmund was furious. He confronted Clara. She blamed me. Miss Marple was silent. He covered it up, Harriet continued. He found Rose, placed her in a private home under a different name, paid for it quietly. He said no one could know. Not for his sake, for mine. I begged him not to expose me. I thought it would pass. But she never came back. She died there, alone. You let James believe your brother had been the villain, Miss Marple said. You let him kill him. Harriet's voice broke. I didn't know who James was. I didn't know he even existed. Until the very end. Edmund said he wanted to speak out. I tried to stop him. He said it was time for the truth. And that's when Clara acted. Harriet nodded once, her face pale. I never told her the whole story. Just that someone had come. I never thought she'd still be capable of... Miss Marple stood slowly. James deserves to know the truth. Harriet looked at her. And what will you tell him? That he murdered the wrong person? That the one he hated was trying to protect his mother, not destroy her? I'll tell him his mother mattered to someone, she said, even if it was too late to make it right. Outside, the air was crisp and the light clear. No more fog, no more rain, just the bare truth laid open. Miss Marple walked straight to the hospital, note in hand, past constables and clerks and quiet rooms. She sat beside James Halberton once more. I have something, she said, that changes everything. And as he read his mother's name again, this time in the Reverend's own handwriting, something in his eyes shifted. The grief remained, but the hatred drained, not replaced by peace, not yet, but by the beginnings of understanding, and that, Miss Marple knew, was how justice truly ended, not with punishment, but with clarity. The silence in James Halberton's hospital room was long and difficult. He had read the note 3 times by the time Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and waited. Her gaze never left him, and though she said nothing more, The weight of her presence steadied the trembling that had begun in his fingers. When he finally looked up, there was no rage left in his face. Only the hollowed look of someone who had built his entire identity on a single belief, only to watch it collapse under the weight of an unwanted truth. "She wasn't betrayed," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "She was hidden for me." Miss Marple nodded. "Protected by a man you believed had destroyed her. That doesn't erase what followed, but it changes what came before." "She died thinking I'd never know," he murmured. "She was taken, renamed, forgotten. I came back to avenge her, but he saved her, at least for a while." "You were never told," she said gently. "That doesn't make your grief wrong, but it does change the shape of your revenge." He looked down, at the note again, then to the brass bed frame. "And Harriet," Miss Marple hesitated. "She did not kill your mother, but her silence enabled those who did. She let others carry the burden, then allowed you to place your hate where it didn't belong." He closed his eyes. "I should feel relief, but I don't." "No," she said. "You feel what your mother must have felt, too late and too alone." By the time Inspector Pritchard returned to the hospital with a formal statement in hand, James Halberton had given a quiet, precise confession. He had recounted the lies, the disguise, the poisoning of the Reverend, the evidence already aligned with his version of events, and now that he confirmed it all, the legal machinery began its slow, grinding motion. But there was no sense of triumph. Even Pritchard, usually so procedural, spoke quietly as he sealed the envelope. Harriet Chiswell, however, would never be charged. Her role, while morally damning, was legally incomplete. She had not administered the poison. She had not silenced Rose. Her influence had made the circumstances possible, but influence, however poisonous, wasn't a crime on its own. She resigned from every committee, packed her bags, and left the vicarage without farewell. The morning. She departed. Miss Marple watched from the garden gate as Harriet stepped into a cab, her eyes forward, her mouth a tight, unreadable line. She carried no suitcase, only a box of letters. Later that week, Miss Marple was invited to speak at the church memorial, a modest ceremony held for the Reverend Margaret Benton, Rose Halberton, and Elsie Dodd. There were no grand gestures. Only the naming of those who had been silenced and a new plaque installed behind the altar inscribed with dates, initials, and a simple final line: "May truth be kinder than silence." After the service, Inspector Pritchard lingered beside her in the aisle, his hands clasped behind his back. "It's finished, then," he said. "In the eyes of the law, at least." "In the law's eyes," Miss Marple said softly. "Yes, but not yours." She looked toward the pulpit, where the green hymn book now rested beneath the new one, shelved but not forgotten. "Clara Drew is still alive. She administered the drug to Chiswell, even if it was in panic. But she will not be tried. Her health is failing. Her memory selective. She will not last the year." Pritchard nodded. "She said she'd rather die in her cell than in a hospital." "She may get both," Miss Marple murmured. "And Harriet?" Miss Marple turned to him. "Harriet walks free, but she walks with the knowledge that her silence destroyed a woman's life, pushed her brother to despair, and gave a man cause to kill. That's a prison of its own." Pritchard looked down. "And you? Do you ever feel satisfaction when it's over?" Miss Marple considered. "No, only clarity." They left together through the chapel doors, the sun setting across the fields. The village had returned to a new kind of quiet, more cautious, more watchful. Trust had been shaken, not just in institutions, but in people. And yet, life had resumed. The market reopened. The bell tower was repaired. Children played in the square again, though their laughter came softer. Tom Abbott had chosen to stay. He was given a small flat above the parish storehouse, offered a position as assistant groundskeeper, Miss Marple saw him once by the river, tossing breadcrumbs to the ducks, the expression on his face not joyful, but peaceful in its own way. He had stopped asking about his mother. He had started planting vegetables instead. And yet, just when Miss Marple had begun to feel the rhythm of the village settling once more, a letter arrived. There was no return address, only her name, written in a hand she didn't recognize. Inside was a single page, and on it, a phrase that turned her blood cold. She wasn't the only one he protected. No signature, no context. Miss Marple sat with it for a long time. Had someone else vanished? Had Edmund Chiswell buried yet another secret, one that hadn't yet surfaced? Was there another life, erased just as thoroughly as Rose's? She folded the paper slowly, placed it in her desk drawer and locked it. Justice had been served. But only for those who'd been uncovered. There were always more stories in a village, and always more shadows waiting to be disturbed. Miss Marple straightened her shoulders, poured a fresh cup of tea, and took out her notebook once more. The story was not quite finished. It never was. Miss Marple sat quietly in her cottage as twilight curled around the hedges, cloaking the windows in dusky violet. The letter lay inside her writing desk, its plainness now weighted with implication. She wasn't the only one he protected. The sentence turned over in her thoughts like a loose thread in well-worn fabric. It was phrased with intention, as if penned by someone who knew precisely the kind of doubt it would stir. Neither accusation nor confession, but provocation. Whoever wrote it didn't want her to close the book just yet. The case of Reverend Chiswell's murder had consumed the village for weeks, and rightly so. It had exposed decades of lies, forced names long buried to resurface, and pulled James Halberton from the shadows of vengeance into the hard light of understanding. Yet this letter, a single sentence, unsigned, suggested that the layers went deeper still. And Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime understanding people rather than merely catching them, couldn't shake the feeling that something had slipped past her. Something deliberate. The next morning, under the guise of a leisurely visit, she returned to the vicarage, where the interim vicar had taken up residence. The sitting room had been cleared of Chiswell's personal items, the air now stale with neutrality. But she wasn't here for sentiment. She walked slowly, noting the corners, the untouched books still stacked on high shelves. Then she turned to the fireplace. There had always been a photograph on the mantel, one of a young girl beside a lake, frame tarnished with time. She had assumed it to be Margaret, but when she looked at it again now, the details tugged differently. The child was no older than 10. The photograph wasn't staged, but candid. The girl was half-turned, laughing at someone just out of frame. It was the kind of image one didn't keep for propriety's sake. It was personal. Miss Marple reached for the back of the frame and removed the photograph. On the reverse, in faint penciled script, was a date, 1923, and 2 initials. L.C. She stared at the writing for several long seconds. L.C., not Margaret, not Rose. But the child in the photo wasn't unfamiliar. Not exactly. She'd seen similar cheekbones before, a narrow jawline like that of Harriet Chiswell. No, not Harriet. Someone else. A resemblance she couldn't quite place. She took the photograph to Inspector Pritchard that afternoon. "I'm not saying this proves anything," she said, "but I'd like to know who this child was." Pritchard examined it and frowned. "This was on the Reverend's mantel. All the years I've visited, I assumed it was someone obvious, but it never came up, and he never explained it." "We've combed his personal effects," Pritchard said. "No mention of a child named L.C., no record of guardianship, no letters." "Which makes it all the stranger," Miss Marple murmured. He ran the initials through archived parish records, combing through christenings from the 1920s, and, after several hours, found a single match. Louisa Clark, born 1913, baptized in St. Edward's. Guardian listed as E. Chiswell. No parents named. Miss Marple sat back, eyes narrowing. A ward. One whose presence had never been discussed, not even during the investigation. Yet she had been important enough to warrant a place on his mantle for decades. That night, she returned to the hymn book, the green one. She turned to the back pages, searching not for notes this time, but for clues of habit. There, tucked between the last two pages, was a pressed flower, a blue cornflower, dried and fragile. Tucked into its stem was a short ribbon of cloth, navy blue, frayed at the end. A piece of a school sash, Louisa Clark, a ward of the Reverend, a child hidden from the records, now long vanished from living memory. Had she died young, been sent away, or something else? The question unsettled Miss Marple more than she expected. She had spent her life solving things, restoring order to chaos, but this detail lingered like a page torn from the end of a novel. It wasn't conclusive. It wasn't even disruptive. But it was unfinished. And then, almost as if summoned by the quiet ripple of the thought, another letter arrived. Delivered not by post, but slipped beneath her door sometime in the night. You're looking in the right direction, but she didn't vanish. She changed her name. So did others. You'll know where to look. Miss Marple read it twice. There was no signature, but the ink was identical to the previous message. Same hand, same purpose. A nudge forward. She sat in silence for a long time. If Louisa Clark had lived and changed her name, she could still be somewhere nearby, perhaps even part of the investigation. A witness, a neighbor, someone in the church community who had watched the unraveling of the Chiswell legacy without ever revealing their own piece of it. She looked once more at the ribbon, then returned to the parish records. Not the christenings this time, but the marriage registries. It took 2 hours, but there it was. Louisa Clark married Harold Webb in 1931, Wexby. She cross-referenced the name with the electoral rolls. Harold Webb had died in 1943. His widow had moved to Nether Farthing in 1945. The name listed on the property deed, Penelope Webb, the same Penelope who had tended the flowers outside the church for 30 years, who had died quietly in her sleep only a month before Chiswell's death. The death everyone had thought unrelated. Miss Marple exhaled very slowly. She remembered Penelope Webb, sharp eyes always humming hymns, forever tucked just behind the action, not unkind, but reticent, and always protective of the Reverend's memory. Perhaps she had been Louisa. And perhaps she had carried a secret that had remained untouched, even as the other layers fell away. She would never know for certain now. But the suggestion was enough. The photograph, the flower, the note. Someone still wanted her to find more, but had left the rest in silence. The next day, Miss Marple walked again to the church, placed a fresh flower beneath the new plaque, and stood there in the echoing calm of the empty nave. Justice, she knew, wasn't always about verdicts. Sometimes it was about naming, about remembrance, and sometimes the deepest truths weren't tied to crimes at all, but to the spaces where people had simply chosen to vanish, to rebuild, to survive. As she turned to leave, her eyes caught the open hymnal at the lectern. Hymn 4031. She didn't remember being sung at any recent service. She approached, Lord of the far horizon, guide the seeker's feet. She smiled faintly. A mystery never truly ends. It only waits. Sometimes in silence, sometimes in shadows, and sometimes it speaks through forgotten hands, gently turning the page.